We are quite convinced that the general public, the tech and industry leaders, as well as most scientists, feel sure that we humans actually have no efficient or of-scale way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We claim and prove in this video and series that we humans firmly have in reach a costless, easy, and logical way to remove all post-industrial carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and this in a surprisingly short period of time, certainly in less than 20 years. Instead of focusing on carbon dioxide one way or the other, we prefer to focus and alert for an alarming rate of degeneration of all our productive soils, which are as much as 13 billion hectares, this when only the productive agricultural lands are considered. 13 billion hectares roughly is 2 times the size of the continental USA, or 2 times Europe, or 2 times the Amazon forest across South America. Well, until 2050, 90% of this immense and for human health, thriving and existence essential areas will have become irreversibly unproductive. Surprisingly or perhaps shockingly, nobody seems to talk or to care about it, so we 8 billion or more modern humans could very well be in for a very ugly surprise or rather red alarm, and that long before 2050, this unless we urgently wake up for this challenge, and use our immense but by most unrecognized potential or rather that of carbon agroforests, to transform this and other threats in thriving and solving. As an example, an unmanaged tropical forest, and that includes certain of the most productive planted forests, but above all the carbon agroforests, produce roughly 30 metric tons of biomass a year, and per hectare. When expressed in carbon content, that roughly is the equivalent of the yearly production of 30 tons of carbon dioxide, like the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, including the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere emitted by the burning of fossil fuels. So if we transform only 76% of our most degenerated or already unproductive agricultural land in carbon agroforest, we would be transforming, and much more importantly regenerating roughly 1 billion of hectares of kind of newly productive land, this if optimally and dedicatedly done, into some of the most biodiverse forests ever known. In the case all agricultural land would be upgraded to carbon agroforests, this regenerated and carbon dioxide removing area could become as much as 13 billion hectares or even more, and this in a limited number of years. But even by transforming a more modest 1 billion hectares of degenerated agricultural land into carbon agroforests would remove roughly 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, in the case that is of our interest. Just as a reference. As of early 2024, 27 direct air capture or DAC plants were in operation worldwide, capturing the for removal insignificant amount of 1.3 million tons of carbon dioxide per year in 2023. Please notice that the BIOS proposed 1 billion of hectares of carbon agroforests would remove the amount of 30 billion tons per year, which roughly is the amount of the yearly accumulation of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, which includes the emissions caused by the burning of fossil fuels worldwide, but also, the BIOS more critically considered, substantial and rapidly increasing emissions caused by the degeneration of our immense area of agricultural soils. Possibly the general public is not really aware that nearly all agricultural lands are tilled by large machines at least once a year, and that tilling especially over the long term leads to a net loss of soil organic carbon which is emitted into the Earth's atmosphere. In other words, even if the burning of fossil fuels would become zero, our actual agricultural practices would still lead to substantial, possibly to even higher carbon dioxide emissions than actually are the case. As said before, it is not the carbon dioxide emission that we see as the main challenge, but it is the immense and kind of exponential soil degeneration that we see as the main challenge. In fact, we see it as a direct challenge for human and animal existence. Besides, as explained just earlier, soil degeneration could and probably will become our main source of future still or even more massive carbon dioxide emissions. This makes that solving soil degeneration should be an absolute priority, including in order to avoid human and animal extinction. It should also or even more be considered a priority, because apart from its importance regarding existence, non-degenerated soils obviously are the basis of human thriving, health, quality of life as well as life expectancy. In other words, we see the action plan of transforming 1 billion hectares of degenerated and eventually already unproductive soils into carbon agroforest as kind of mandatory, that is if we humans want to thrive and stay healthy, and we see carbon dioxide removal rather as a logic but beneficial collateral of the principal aiming, this through an action plan, for all humans to remain thriving or to thrive more, as well as to maintain or to improve our health, and consequential our life expectancy, as well as achieving a minimum of natural birth rates, aspects that especially rather recently became clearly challenged. Brazil's agricultural land area, including crops and pastures, is estimated to be around 250 million hectares, and it produces around 10% of all food of the world. Just for your info, and maybe to the surprise of many, the Brazilian part of the Amazon forest comprises roughly 420 million hectares, almost the double of Brazil's agricultural land area. 10% of carbon agroforests used for food production. If only 10% of the 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest capacity would be used for food production, and assuming the proven fact that carbon agroforest produces 100 times more biomass than that traditional agriculture does produce crops, that would make that 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest would produce 400% of all the food that 8 billion humans consume today. Even considering the use of only 10% of the 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest capacity. Now we reach out to an earlier calculation made in an earlier video, and further we will base on the proven fact that carbon agroforests produce at least 50 tons of wood or for biogas production suitable biomass per year and per hectare, compared to the about 30 metric tons of biomass for a standard tropical forest, simply because carbon agroforests have much deeper and more fertile soils. And on top of that are managed for additional production, as well as for dedicated or directional production. The evidence for this is presented in other videos. Carbon agroforest natural gas versus fossil natural gas. You will notice that we refer to carbon agroforest natural gas when it is prevenient from gasification or a kind of cooking of biomass prevenient from carbon agroforests, and we refer to fossil natural gas when it is prevenient from extraction from the Earth's soil. The carbon agroforest natural gas does not contain toxic elements. This while fossil natural gas or the gas dominantly on the market contains small quantities of toxics or rather elements that can be toxic for humans and animals, or prejudice their health, simply because fossil natural gas contains toxins from the mineral layers it was extracted from. 10% of carbon agroforests used for natural gas production. 50 tons of wood or biomass per year and per hectare will result in 18 tons of syngas or 16.2 tons of carbon agroforest natural gas. 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest will result in 18 billion tons of syngas or 16.2 billion tons of carbon agroforest natural gas. The global natural gas production, which is of fossil origin, amounted to some 4 trillion cubic meters in 2023 or 300 million tons of natural gas. So in order to set off global natural gas production, less than 2% of the capacity of the 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest is needed. So the production of 1 billion hectares will, on top of the additional food or on top of the 400% of all the food 8 billion humans consume today, produce a further 100% of the actual global production of natural gas. Natural gas burning without emissions and without toxins. As said, any actually produced and consumed gas prevenient, like for example from Yemen, is in fact fossil gas, and when burned or used will obviously emit carbon dioxide. None of the natural gas produced by the here proposed or any other agroforests will cause an increase of emissions, because months and/or years before the burning and consequent emissions, the amount of carbon dioxide equal to or equivalent to the expected emission will have been already captured from the atmosphere. In other words, what will be emitted was sequestered out of the atmosphere and before. And while this is no carbon dioxide removal, it surely is a temporarily carbon dioxide removal. In any case, the burning of natural gas from carbon agroforest is not an emitter. Furthermore, contrary to traditionally produced natural gas or what we call fossil natural gas, carbon agroforest natural gas does not contain toxins. This while so-called natural gas from fossil origin contains toxins, simply because it contains toxins from the mineral layers it was extracted from. 10% of the carbon agroforests used for superior gasoline production. Syngas to gasoline plus, STG plus, is a thermochemical process to convert natural gas, other gaseous hydrocarbons or gasified biomass into drop-in fuels, such as gasoline, diesel fuel or jet fuel, and organic solvents. This process is about 60% efficient, with a 40% loss of energy. 50 tons of wood or biomass per year and per hectare will result in 18 tons of syngas or over 16.2 tons of natural gas. For 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest, this results in 18 billion tons of syngas, or approximately 18 billion barrels of gasoline. Global gasoline demand was approximately 27 million barrels per day in 2023, and will stabilize at 29.6 million barrels per day, or 10.8 billion barrels per year through 2050. In other words, only 60% of the 1 billion hectares of carbon agroforest needs to be dedicated to the production of gasoline, when this is in order to offset all fossil gasoline and its emissions. Still 80% of the carbon agroforest's capacity remains available. We would like to remind you that up to this moment we have given a destination to only 20% of the production capacity of the proposed carbon agroforest area of 1 billion hectares, or roughly the size of the Amazon forest. Obviously, this tremendous potential could form and be seen as a clear challenge for several industries and companies, including several international industries and companies. In fact, and just for instance, the bicarbon agroforests produce superior and 100% or even over 100% renewable gasoline plus, as well as other superior and also renewable fuels could very well challenge the ongoing transition to electrical cars, hybrid cars, as well as the whole of the so-called clean energy transition, and make the use of internal combustion cars competitive or even advantageous, as well as also less emittent, zero emittent, or even carbon dioxide removing, with the latter being impossible in the case of electrical vehicles. Apart from this, the use of gasoline plus from carbon agroforests could make internal combustion vehicles and motors the safest option. This latter could matter in all cases of parking, tunnel use. People with internal combustion vehicles and motors would be released from the urge and pressure to make the transition to electrical vehicles right away or as soon as possible. Industrial zones redundant. On top of all this, the here discussed carbon agroforests would make industrial zones or most parts of it redundant. This is something that even the combination of alternative energy generation and electrical vehicles is not capable of, simply because they are not an alternative for all the other hydrocarbons that, maybe to the surprise of many, surpass the actual need for gasoline by far. At the same time, carbon agroforests allow for totally other ways of much more autonomous, economical and sustainable transoceanic and global transport and trade, amongst others because of the independence from industrial zones. Without carbon agroforest and their production, industrial zones and ports are highly interdependent. This connection between industrial zones and ports creates industrial port zones, where the activities of both are spatially and economically integrated. Obviously, such industrial port zones have huge impacts. Soil compaction and loss, a thing of the past. Soil compaction and degeneration by means of soil compaction would cease to exist. In fact, a significant, if not the larger part, of roads and driveways in agricultural areas would become redundant, and obviously once more become available for carbon agroforest and its wide variety of production and services. New, better, cleaner, and in fact unedited carbon dioxide removal opportunities for tech leaders. On the other hand, the leaders of the above-mentioned industries and/or companies and/or even governments could very well envision that involvement in the massive new market of carbon agroforest robots, drones and systems could be much more lucrative or be more lucrative in a much shorter period of time, compared to any other economic activity. After all, it is about the basics of everything humans need, with quite some of the mining and/or production of these basics being fundamentally challenged. We are quite convinced that the dedicated robot, drone, and system market for the management and harvesting of these carbon agroforests is much bigger and much more secure than that of electrical vehicles or any other type of vehicles. We insist to remind that carbon agroforest can produce masses of all basic materials that we 8 billion humans need and demand, obviously in a sustained and toxic-free way, and apart from healthy and organic foods, that includes the most modern or the most actual of basic materials, like for instance amongst many or in fact all others, graphite, carbon fiber, superior and toxic-free gasoline, hydrogen, electricity in all its forms, as well as possibly surprisingly rare earth elements and other materials in high demand. In other videos we will calculate how much more of this carbon agroforest capacity would be needed for all of the remaining carbohydrates, other than gasoline, to be set off.